And for those of you that are joining us from different time zones around the world, I know it's early in some places and late in others. We appreciate your attendance. Thank you. All right, we are about 4 after. Looks like our attendees list has leveled off a little bit. So let's go ahead and get started. Once again, welcome to SmartBear's presentation today for Collaborator, our summer school session number 2, Innovation with New Integrations. So today's focus is going to be on the various types of integrations that Collaborator supports. We are going to do a little bit of kind of review workflow as well, but it's going to be more discussion around how we can integrate Collaborator with the various types of source control management solutions, as well as some of our additional tools. So a few housekeeping items to start with. Our session today is being recorded. Please post your questions to the Q&A channel. And we will also leave a little bit of time at the end for additional questions and answers. So my name is Mel Gage. I am the solutions engineer supporting Collaborator here at SmartBear. And joining me off camera today is my fellow colleague, Andrew Murata from our marketing group, who does a fantastic job getting this information out to you folks, as well as helping me get set up for these webinars. So we'll start with a little bit about what SmartBear is. So SmartBear is the biggest little company you've never heard of. Our tools are out there. A lot of organizations are using them, such as Swagger Hub, SOAP UI, Ready API. Our tool suites are very extensive in the testing and development worlds, load testing and performance testing, and then with Collaborator, also the peer review and quality improvement. So look to SmartBear for the tools that you need in your software development lifecycle. We were founded in 2009. We are a global company with offices all around the world, and we continue to expand and increase our product offerings with new acquisitions, the latest of which is Bugsnags. So we have additional tools, and for anybody that was on my last session, we were touting about 650 employees, and you can see we continue to grow. Our tools help you with your SDLC to accelerate development, deployment, and quality. And our tool suite, as I mentioned, spans the design, test, and monitoring, and then with Collaborator, the review portions of your software development lifecycle. So the remainder of our agenda today, we're going to be looking at Collaborator Client GUI integrations, Collaborator webhooks integrations, the Jira integration, Simulink, and then we'll do a brief demonstration in the server on the different types of integrations with a Q&A session, and then our next event in the summer school series upcoming in September. Like I said, if you have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A and post those. Andrew is watching those, and he will let me know when they come in. But we're going to start with our first poll. If you are Collaborator users, which integrations are you currently using? So we'll kick that off. And then we're going to go ahead and begin. So Collaborator is an extremely extensive tool. It's the oldest tool here at Collaborator SmartBear. And we started with the Enterprise Client GUI integrations, which is what we're going to look at first. We have expanded the capabilities of Collaborator as the industry has evolved with the webhooks integrations into the various Git repositories. We also tie into Jira for issue tracking. And with our latest integration, Simulink, we give you options to review Simulink models in a fashion that hasn't been seen in other tools so far in the industry. So we're going to start with our Enterprise Client GUI. So the graphical user interface option to create reviews and tie into your source control management systems. So looking at how this integration works, I want to touch on a couple things with Collaborator that come up on my calls that I don't think a lot of organizations using Collaborator fully grasp. So I want to touch on a couple of additional concepts in some of these slides. So we're going to start with your Collaborator server. So this is on-prem or in cloud in your network infrastructure, and it's mapped to an associated SQL server. So this is the database server. We obviously have communications between the two on a high-speed, low-latency link, preferably. But the piece that a lot of organizations seem to miss is where content is actually stored. So Collaborator on the server itself has a content cache, and with the release of our Simulink integration, a new web server cache. These are the locations where all of your content for your reviews get copied to the server. So the server actually brings local copies of those review materials onto Collaborator to make the response in the web UI much quicker. So it doesn't have to reach out to your source control management tools and grab those every time they need them. It also becomes that important archive process for those organizations that are under auditing or regulatory requirements to be able to produce reviews for inspectors at a given moment. All of your server and your review data information, so such as your users and your groups and your templates and your checklists, all of your review data for comments, for defects, all of this gets stored on the SQL server. So Collaborator is constantly polling between those. And as an update on some of our new recent developments, we did some testing on the communications between Collaborator and the SQL server and found that Collaborator was talking to our server very regularly. So our development team has been hard at work on improving the communications between Collaborator and the associated SQL server, and we've really toned down the amount of chatter between the two to make our process and our performance that much more efficient. So moving on with the client GUI integrations, we moved to the user workstations. This is where everybody's doing their work, and we install the enterprise client GUI on the workstation itself. So the client GUI is then used to map between the user workstations, Collaborator, and your source control management servers. And for the client GUI integration, and this is just a handful of them, we support 11 integrations. So Git Subversion, Perforce, ClearCase, PTC Integrity. So all of this communication is done from the enterprise client GUI out to these source control management servers. And I see a question coming in, so let's take a look at that question from Michael. What are security options available between the Collaborator server and the SQL server? That is an excellent question. Could you, here actually, let me see if I can find you, Michael. I'll let you ask your question. All right, Mike, you're live with us. You can unmute, and could you elaborate a little bit more what you're looking for as far as the security question goes?
Right, so depending on what kind of permissions, authorization and authentication infrastructure you have. So if we've got SSO with certificates or MFA, is the SQL server participating in that, or is the Collaborator server? I'm just wondering, because of the communications going back and forth between Collaborator and SQL server, how do we lock that down, or is that easily integrated into whatever AAUM we're using?
So the Collaborator server itself can be secured with SSO as well as through LDAP and Active Directory. So you've got a couple different options there on how to secure authentication with the Collaborator server. The communications to the SQL server are simply negotiated with a secure username and password between Collaborator and the SQL server. So just as an example, I'll just take a moment to discuss that. And I can show you in my local server as well. I'm pulling up my SQL workbench. So I've got my Collaborator instance in my SQL, and it's simply a username and password communication security between Collaborator and the SQL server on an account that is not a Collaborator account. Does that sufficiently answer your question for you?
Yes, just as it would be good to be, as a enhancement request is to be able to set up certificates between those two that were private to that connection.
Okay.
Because as you're doing software development, often there are shortcuts and things taken in source code before it becomes production, and there could be things in that source code that you don't want leaking out even into your own environment. So it just would be good to be able to control that.
So just as a caveat to that, there are access restrictions. So remember, none of my code actually gets stored on the SQL Server. All of my code files stay on the Collaborator server. So nothing gets communicated down to the SQL Server except those review fields, such as defects, users, groups, that information. So none of your code actually goes to the SQL Server. And beyond that, in the Collaborator server itself, you can set server-side access restrictions at the server level for all of the reviews that are in process, or on the individual review level as you're creating them to restrict access to any reviews beyond participants and groups assigned to those reviews.
Right. But yeah, not to go too far down this rabbit hole, but
Sure.
Longitudinal attacks often start with something that just gives you access to something else, right?
Understandably so. Mm-hmm.
So you got permissions or usernames even going back and forth between a Collaborator server that give you hints as to how you can get access to the SCM.
Understandably so. Mm-hmm. All right, I will take that as a note, and I will see if I can get some more information on that and get back to you, okay?
Excellent, thank you.
Sure. All right, so moving on. So the Enterprise Client GUI communicates to our source control management tools, and then it is used to create our reviews in the Collaborator server. So the Enterprise Client GUI attaches materials, whether in a pre-commit review workflow or a post-commit review workflow. The choice is yours. The user then logs into the web UI and communicates to the Collaborator server to facilitate the rest of the review, setting up the initial planning phase and then moving it to the participants for the review phase. Now, for a handful of our SCM types, there is a version control integration supported in Collaborator. And let's just take a quick look at what the client GUI looks like. Here, I've got my client GUI, and we'll see that I've got many different version controls set up to communicate to my Collaborator server. The one I demo most frequently is my local Subversion repository. And we can see it's mapped to my Subversion server with my local file checkout here. And then the Enterprise Client GUI manages all the communications between Collaborator and the source control management tools. Your preferences specify your user credentials. So each user on their workstation has their own credentials to communicate to the Collaborator server. Now, with some of the organizational types or some of the source control management types, we can look at those in the Collaborator. It will also map those under version control. And those types are clear case, Git, Perforce, RTC, and Subversion. And as we build out our connections in our Enterprise Client GUI, Collaborator will also map those version control servers here in the server, where we can manage and determine whether or not we want to maintain those connections as an administrator. So this is the older style of Collaborator, how we were communicating with the server in the early days of the application. So as the industry evolved with the Git workflow and Git integrations, we evolved with it as well. So with the webhooks integrations, we start with the same basic setup: our Collaborator server and SQL server, our content. It's all stored in exactly the same fashion. But now we start with our workstations, and we start with our cloud or on-prem versions of the Git-based systems. And today we're going to be talking about GitLab, GitHub, Bitbucket, and Azure DevOps as our latest integration. So these are the four that we're really focused on here at SmartBear for communications with Collaborator. So with the Git workflows, your users have their local copies that then communicate up to the source control management system. They make changes, they do pushes up to those servers. And then we manage a webhooks communication between Collaborator and those source control tools. And that webhook integration communicates between Collaborator and GitLab or the Git repositories. to manage things like the pull requests, pushes. And Collaborator adds more functionality in these types of integrations as well. You can use Collaborator in some cases to bring your reviewers right out of your source control management tools into your reviews through direct adding to a pull request, or in some cases through the code owner's file. You can manage what goes on in the Collaborator server. We've added additional tools as well to make this integration even easier, such as repository auto polling, so you can pull new repos from these systems as they're added. Our typical workflow, then we use the pull request to create our reviews in Collaborator, or a push request, and we then log in through the web UI to log into Collaborator and manage the rest of the workflow. Now, Collaborator supports many, many connections, so you can look at different source control tools within your organization. If you're in a large organization, maybe you've got some groups using GitLab, maybe you've got some groups using GitHub. You can tie those all into the same Collaborator server, as with Bitbucket and as with Azure DevOps. So you can manage all of these connections very, very easily within the server itself using the tools available. And again, Collaborator can then become a quality control organization or quality control tool in your process suite that can prevent you from doing code merges until reviews are complete, ensuring that you're getting those additional eyes onto your reviews, onto your materials before they get merged into your deployment branches. The Jira integration is also webhook based. We start with our same setup, and we've got our Jira server, whether it's SaaS or on-prem. We communicate to Collaborator with a webhooks integration. And then the users through the web UI and integrate and interacting with reviews can create links directly into Jira right out of their review materials. In addition, we also have a plugin for Jira that gives you additional functionality with communications back to Collaborator. You can create reviews right out of Jira and then use the manual option to upload files to those reviews. You can link issues in Jira to existing reviews in Collaborator if you need to. And we also, as we'll see today with my GitHub integration, we also provide links through that tool to the associated source control management tools as well. So a question coming in from Samir: are there drawbacks of having both Collaborator Server and SQL Server on a single powerful server? If your server is sized properly for both of the application, there's absolutely no drawback to having those unless you consider the hardware as a single point of failure. But if you are in a high availability type of infrastructure, you're making backups to those servers anyway. So in my opinion, there's absolutely zero drawbacks to having the SQL Server and Collaborator Server on the same box. It increases the communications between the two different servers and makes for a very seamless integration. Falling back on one of our recent trouble tickets, we had one organization that was experiencing high latency between their Collaborator server and their database server. What we found through a little bit of investigation was this user had their Collaborator server set up in Florida and their database server was in Texas. And so the latency on those links between those two servers was causing a lot of issues for them. Once we discovered that discrepancy, they actually stood up they made an easy copy through the Collaborator tool suite of that database, stood up a new database server in their Florida location, and resolved all of the latency issues that they were seeing in their review process. So Samir, and I'm running that way. My SQL server is set up here on my laptop to communicate to my local Collaborator server. So absolutely. Thanks, Michael. Yeah, the laws of physics do apply, even in Texas. So the Jira integration becomes very useful for tying in on those issue tracking services. And we're going to take a look at these integrations as well. With our newest integration, we're also tying into Simulink, and we've seen a lot of organizations come to us and tell us that this is the kind of tool that they've been looking for some time. When it comes to diffing views in Collaborator on Simulink models, And we're continuing to improve this integration, just as we do with a lot of our other integrations. We've taken customer feedback, and we're currently in work on integrating this directly into the Git repository systems, so we can identify Simulink models on pull requests and create reviews appropriately there, ensuring that what we're reviewing is exactly what's in source control. But presently, with our basic infrastructure, our user workstations have our MATLAB Simulink installed with their own licenses. And there's two ways that we can currently bring models out of Simulink into Collaborator. Using the manual process, where we export out of Simulink into an HTML zip package. Then through the web UI, we create our review and do a manual upload of those artifacts into the review for the review process. The second option is with the plugin. So we've developed a Collaborator plugin that installs in MATLAB, and we can see that here. When we launch that plugin out of MATLAB, it communicates to our Collaborator server, much like our Enterprise Client GUI does, and gives us options on what to upload as far as our models, the models that we want to upload, and whether or not we want to include additional references, library models, and as well as masked subsystems. We can use this to create reviews right in Collaborator without having to go through that manual process. So we pass through the Collaborator plugin tool, which then reaches out to the Collaborator server, creates our reviews, and attaches those materials. You can also use this to update reviews in Collaborator, just as you can with the Enterprise Client GUI, once you've made changes to your models in Simulink. And you can do, I've done it both ways, where I've made changes to my models and haven't saved them. It still pulls those in. What we see the difference there is when you open up your model package in Collaborator, they're obviously going to have the same date and timestamp on them because they haven't been resaved. Yet all of my changes are going to get pulled in. Once I save it, it will update those date and timestamps and typically increment my version name on my models and bring those in and show those in the diff viewer if you do a save before attaching. So one of the processes we're looking at by bringing this into the Git world, a lot of organizations will put their Simulink models into Git, since Git is integrated into MATLAB. So we're looking at that integration as well, so that when we kick off a pull request review out of a Git repository that has Simulink models in it, we're going to be able to identify those models and pass it through the same process using the report generator toolbox to create the views that we're going to be seeing in Collaborator. Then we open the web UI and go through our typical review process as usual. So we've touched on several different integration types today: the Client GUI integration, the webhooks integration, Jira, and the Simulink integration. So we're going to touch briefly on the review workflow. For those of you that are Collaborator users, I'm sure you're familiar with this workflow. For those of you that are seeing Collaborator for the first time today, let's take a look at that review process. So with the integrations, the author chooses the system that he wants to upload to, makes changes to his code files, and then gets those files into Collaborator, whether it's through the Client GUI, webhooks integrations, or even the manual uploads. Once those materials are created and uploaded to the server, the author logs into the web UI and finds himself in the planning phase, where they'll make group assignments, template assignments, add any additional information that they need to, maybe based on custom fields. They'll assign participants in a variety of roles. Collaborator supports 4 roles that can be customized, so you can add users to your reviews as you see fit based on your organizational structures. Once those participants are added, the review is moved to the inspection phase. All those participants will get notified via email that they have review activities available to them. They can log in right out of those emails. They can make comments, mark up defects on the attached artifacts. Then they send that back to rework for the author to make changes based on that feedback. Once the author does so and attaches new materials through any of the various methods, he sends it back to inspection for the reviewers to evaluate those changes. If additional items need to be resolved, they can push it back to rework and allow the author to make additional changes. And this inspection rework cycle can go on as many times as necessary until everyone is satisfied that all of the markup defects have been resolved, and we can move that review to the completed state. Now, depending on the type of integration we're working with, that completion state can mean a couple of different things. In the client GUI applications, there are some of the source control management tools that have additional functionality where you can specify whether or not that completion notifies other people or updates the source control management tools. Many times it's simply knowing that as the author and the review is complete, you log into those tools and you promote your code as necessary. In the newer webhooks based applications, as I mentioned, you can set Collaborator to be that gating mechanism as well as a control for what happens in those newer systems. Maybe I want to go ahead and have Collaborator tell GitHub or GitLab to go ahead and promote my code when the review is complete rather than having to do it manually. But you can still set that manual option if that's your workflow and you want to control that within the source control management tools. So you always have options. So let's take a quick look at some of the integrations. And like I said, please feel free, ask questions if you have them. We're going to look today at Collaborator. We've already talked about my version control systems here that we've set up through my Enterprise Client GUI. And we're going to see a little bit of both today. I'm going to start with GitHub. And I'm going to create a review out of GitHub using that webhooks integration. And once that review is created, we're going to look at how we can add additional items out of the Enterprise Client GUI to that review if we want to. So we can tie multiple systems into the same review. We've had this request from other organizations where they like, well, we've got a project that spans multiple repos. We want to bring that information in and review it all at once. Now, the pull request functionality is currently limited to a single repo. So when I create my pull request out of that repo on those branches, that is the pull request, and those are the repos and branches associated with that request. However, if we have additional repositories mapped, we can bring those in using the Enterprise Client GUI. We're also in investigation on how we can improve that workflow out of Collaborator. We're looking at whether or not we can maybe create a parent review and associate multiple pull requests with that review. So that is currently under investigation by our development team. And if I had my way, we'd be looking at that very quickly because it's becoming a larger and larger request. But like I said, we're still in investigation and there's currently no time frame for that. Can I zoom in a little bit on my screen? Let's see. I can zoom in some. Let's see if I've got some options here. Let's see. I can zoom in on my web browser. I don't have an option to zoom on my screen here, I don't believe. Yeah, I'm not seeing any options there, John. Steve mentions view options in Zoom. Steve, is that for me or for the other viewers? Okay, so yeah, I can zoom in on my web browser. Certainly, I can bring that in a little bit closer. We can bump that up, and that should help some. Got it. Unfortunately, with some of my other tools, this one's going to be kind of where it is at the moment. So let's take a look at the workflow with the Git repository. So I've got a GitHub repo here. Actually, let me step back a little bit. Let's talk how those integrations work. And let's take a look at that to begin with. So the integrations are enabled here in the server. And you can see we support several different types: TFS, GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket. And whether or not we want to integrate those, we can turn some on, turn some off if we want to disable them. And then from the integrations, we move on to the different types that we want to map into our Collaborator server. Our repository hosting services are for those webhooks integrations. So GitLab, GitHub, Bitbucket, Azure DevOps. You're going to see I've got a lot of repos mapped here from various different server types. I want to be focused on my GitHub setup here today, but it's extremely easy to add new repositories. And with one of our newest features, repository auto polling, we can set up our connections to those particular repositories and those organizational structures. And we can enable auto polling to go out and look at these structures and bring these in as we see fit. If we leave the auto polling turned off, but still configure those organizations, we can run them manually. So just as an example, my GitHub organization, if I want to run my auto polling, and just for those in the know, this there is my token. So it is not currently obfuscated. We are working on a development ticket to obfuscate these in these windows as well. So we can come out and we'll see that my query has shown that I do have one additional repo that has not been mapped into my Collaborator server. I can simply select that and create for that repo. So it becomes very, very easy as you add new projects, as you add new repos, to bring those into Collaborator for your review process. You can also ignore repositories if you wish. If you don't want to bring certain sensitive repository information in, you can set those as ignored, and Collaborator will not bring those in the repository auto polling or for the easy adds as well. So you have options there. So a quick question from Pat: what is the suggested file size limitation of attaching to the review? 574 megabyte file took 23 hours and you ended the process. And you attempted to upload, which took about 5 minutes, but the review has no SVN tracing. Okay, that's a good question. I'm gonna go ahead and copy this, Pat. And the reason let's see, let me put your name in here. Because I've had this question come up a couple times in, surprisingly, just the last couple of weeks about file size limitations. So I'm going to guess part of the issue when you're doing, so I'm assuming that when we're talking about Subversion here, you were actually bringing this in through the Enterprise Client GUI. Now, remember, Collaborator also wants to find previous versions of those files. So if we are doing a diff and there's a previous version of that, then we're going to bring that into the server as well. Now, remember, Collaborator does make copies of those on the local server. Just as a demonstration, here we go. Take a look at my Collaborator server. So this is my local server. It doesn't have a whole lot of information on it. But under my Tomcat folder, we see those two content cache folders, the web server and the content cache. So remember, Collaborator is going to bring copies of those files to the server itself to make those renderings much more quickly. If we're talking about something that's like 574 megabytes, it's going to depend on a couple of things: the latency between Collaborator and your source control management tool to bring that file in addition to the one that you manually attached. So that could be part of the issue, is the latency out of the source control management tool in bringing in files that large. I haven't heard a hard limit on the size of the files, but I will certainly reach out to our development team to see if they have tested files of that 500 plus megabyte size. But as you can see, when you did your manual upload, it took about 5 minutes. But you're right, there's not going to be any subversion tracing because it's not pulling in that previous revision. So it would appear, based on your question, that it's going to be a latency communication between Collaborator and Subversion in bringing in that file that was causing some possible timeouts and some communication issues. So I hope that gives you some place to look. Good question. All right, so let's look at how these integrations are configured once they're set up. Like I said, we're going to look at my GitHub today. So if I take a look at this particular integration, this is all based on an API token. Now, different systems use different options depending on whether or not they're SaaS or whether they are on-prem. And this is especially true for Bitbucket. Bitbucket SaaS requires an API token, an authorization token, whereas GitHub on-prem, Bitbucket on-prem uses a username password combination for those local servers. But we can also use this to specify what we're going to track as far as when is Collaborator going to create reviews based on information associated with this particular repository. With the asterisk here, I'm tracking all of my branches in GitHub. So if I create any type of merge request against any branch in GitHub, I'm going to create a review. Now I can specify which branches I want to look at. If I want to put in branch titles, branch names, then it's only going to look at those particular branches for merge requests to and from those particular branches. We can also look at push functionality. Most organizations use one or the other. So this one is based on pull request or merge requests. This option is based on pushes. Now, I tend to ignore pushes because it can create a lot of chatter on your Collaborator server. For example, if I leave this blank, I am now watching every branch on this particular repository for pushes, and every single push, whether it's a merge push on the server itself, or whether it's a push from my local checkout repository up to the server, is going to generate a review. And as you can imagine, anytime I do a commit and a push, generating a review can get fairly chatty. So if you want to use branches, you can put in a regex expression here that maybe you want to ignore everything except master. Then you can manage that as you see fit, just to get that extra review if you are merging very sensitive code. But again, I use one or the other, and we're just going to use my pull request functionality today. Now, we also talked about status checks. In GitHub, we can specify on the Collaborator server side that my review is required. So when my webhook fires on that merge request up in GitHub and it reaches out to Collaborator and says, okay, I need a review, and I am not going to allow my code merge until this review is complete. Now, depending on the service, and I intended to get the big chart put together, so look for that in the future. I'm going to develop a nice big chart showing, based on these services, what functionality you have or what functionality works in one that doesn't work in another. In the case of GitHub here, this status check in Azure DevOps is the same, is controlled from the Collaborator server side. Now in Bitbucket, you specify that in the Bitbucket side based on branch protections and setting up that Collaborator webhook as a required functionality check. So it's going to depend on which service you use, where that status check can be enforced. We can specify what to do when the review is completed. I've told mine to merge that pull request, but we have several options that we can use. And also, if we're canceling, deleting, or rejecting reviews, what do we do with our pull request? Now, some of the other ones that are very important: reopening a review. When? I have all of these checked, because if I have a pull request, so say I've got this set to do nothing, and I complete my review. I haven't merged anything upstream, and yet a developer comes in behind me and pushes something new to that open pull request. I've already closed my Collaborator review, so how am I ensuring that that new push is going to get reviewed before we do a merge? That's where these come in. If I have these checked and I get a new push to a pull request and the review's been closed, that webhook once more is going to fire into Collaborator and say, hey, there's a review associated with this pull request. I just got a new push. Let's reopen that review. Make sure we get eyes on that code before we actually do a merge. And you can do the same thing with comments or comments on commits. I'll leave mine set for merging. We can wait for signatures if enabled before a merge. So Collaborator can enforce signatures or sign off on a review. And you can hold that merge off until things are actually signed. Can we auto assign reviewers, assign pull request reviewers when the review is created? Now this comes out of the GitHub, so we can add reviewers right there in GitHub. And if those accounts are mapped in Collaborator, which they often are through the LDAP and Active Directory integrations, then we can automatically assign those reviewers. Now, this is one of our newest features, and I really like this one. I haven't really put it into practice yet, but it comes up quite often on how can we ensure the groups that need to be assigned in Collaborator are the ones that are assigned. You can assign a default review template from those that are available in your server, so that every time a review gets created on this particular repo, it's going to use that template. So if you have different project teams and different templates set up for those project teams, you can set those up to automatically use those templates when the review is created. And then through template subscriptions, assign groups, assign users to those reviews automatically here in Collaborator. Again, this is all done through the webhooks. I'm going to go ahead, since I've made some changes, I'm going to go ahead and adjust these. We'll save that. And then I always like to test my connection, make sure everything looks good out to my repos. And then if we did make changes, I'm just going to update my webhook just to make sure everything is good. I did note that earlier today, I logged in, got a notification right here in Collaborator that my token had to be changed because GitHub had made some changes on their side on how authentication tokens worked. So I actually came out to my GitHub repository system. Let's go ahead and zoom in this for those that need to see it. Came in here and yeah, John, yeah, I mean, I was excited about that default review template as well. So with the update, I had to come back in, regenerate my API token, and then just simply drop that new token into my GitHub integrations in Collaborator. So new question from Chris. Can Collaborator suggest reviewers for a particular pull request based on previous commit authors on related file changes? So Collaborator does tend to tell you in reviews. Let me go ahead and maximize my screen here, and we'll just look at one of my previous reviews. We'll see that it shows recent participants here. So if you've got recent participants that you're using or participants that you're leaning on quite heavily, Collaborator is going to show you those in the review process itself. Now, another option when you're talking about related file changes, Collaborator supports subscriptions as well at the user and at the group level. So just to talk briefly about subscriptions, I'm going to go to one of my groups and we'll look at my team Collaborator group. And we're going to see that I have 3 different types of subscriptions. So this is where we can assign users based on templates. That this group, if I use my Mel test template, will always get assigned in the reviewer role. And then how many members of that group I want to assign. And it would add those individually as review participants and let those reviewers decide. Now, when you're talking about file subscriptions, you can specify file patterns. So maybe you've got a particular project naming convention you're using for all your files. You can put in that regex expression that filters on that particular file name and assign certain users based on those incoming file patterns. And review subscriptions handles things at the author level. So whichever author creates the review, we can assign this group in specific roles in the server as well. So subscriptions may be one of the best ways that you can use to manage who gets assigned. Now, out of GitHub, I'm also doing, I can also assign reviewers right out of the pull request process. Bitbucket doesn't support that particular functionality, but GitLab takes it one step further where we can actually use a code owner's file. And I can specify based on file patterns in that code owner's file and filters in the code owners who gets assigned to reviews in Collaborator if those accounts map from Collaborator and GitLab. So there are certain different options based on the solution that you're using in getting reviewers assigned automatically. I'd actually set up my code owner's file to do some testing and had forgotten about it. Came back a couple of weeks later to do some work on a demo and couldn't figure out why I was getting one of my users always assigned to my reviews. And then I remembered my code owner's file in my master branch, went out there, and sure enough, there was that account, but it was automatically assigning that user to every review created against that particular file type. So you can certainly take advantage of those additional settings as well. Great questions, everyone. I know we're down to about 13 minutes. So let's just look at the pull request, the creation of the review, and then how we can also couple that with the Enterprise Client GUI to bring additional files in. So I'm just going to start with a quick change to a file here. And we're looking at my main Java file, and I apologize for the file size for the windows that are not web-based. Just going to drop this one in here, change one. We'll save that file, and then through my workflow process, we're going to add it. We're going to commit it. And then I'm going to push it upstream. Quick question from Pat. How do I see other reviews in the same project that I am not added to? That is a great question. And the answer is it depends. If you are assigned, if you're not assigned to reviews and there's no access restrictions on those reviews, there's a couple different ways you can find those. I'll touch on that in just a moment. So I'll get to it. Here we are in my test one repository. So I need to step back to my demo repo repository where we're working. We're going to see that this one still has an open pull request. We just did this pull request later, but I'm going to do a new pull request. We're going to compare my dev1 patch branch to my master branch. And let's see, we don't want to do that one. So we've got, looks like we've got one already set up. Master to dev1, 2 commits. I did have a review open on this one. So I'd already done a pull request against this particular branch. So we have simply added to this particular pull request and updated that particular review. So as an example, if I go back to my home screen, we're going to see this GitHub pull request, and we've just updated it. So we're actually going to see new updates to that particular pull request, and we're going to see both of my commits on this pull request. So another great feature with the webhooks integrations is that pull requests, pushes to open pull requests will automatically update reviews if they're open. And again, with that checkbox, if you've closed it, it would reopen it as well. So we've updated this pull request, and we're ready to move on with our review process. A lot of you have already seen this, so I'm going to step through this fairly quickly. And we'll add my reviewer. Now we typically move to that inspection phase. So to your question, Pat, in your home screen, a couple of things that you can do. If you have access to reports, you can search and filter on reports. That can be enabled or disabled for individual users at the admin level. But let's assume that you do have access to the reports. You can come in and take one of the canned options, and you're looking for particular review titles. Let's go to my reviews currently in progress. Depending on how your reviews are set up, whether you're capturing project information. Now, if you saw on my review, just to step back, I do have a projects custom field where I'm asked to populate that. Maybe you're putting your project names in your pull request titles that then get populated into the review. You have a couple of different ways that you can search on those items. With a review custom field, you can search and sort on those projects. You can also specify which phase. I'm going to look at all of mine here, but I can also, with those review custom fields, put in keywords in my projects. So maybe I only want to see those projects, those reviews associated with project 8. And when I run this report, it's going to show me all those projects, whether I'm a member of them or not. So you can use the reports to do that. The other way you can access that information, if you are capturing information around project names in your reviews, you can search for keywords here as well. So maybe I want to look for project 8 on my reviews. I can come in and search. I'm going to see all of my reviews coming back that I have access to with those keywords in those projects. So hopefully that helps you find that information that you're looking for. So let's take a quick look at one additional item through the Enterprise Client GUI. So we had created this review, and this is on my GitHub. Now, suppose I want to do a, okay. So let me follow up to that Pat's question. So yes, under search for review number, she gets the response for, and my apologies if I'm assuming the wrong pronoun here, the review number 64 was found, but you do not have access to it. So that's based on access restrictions. So here you'll see I have no access restrictions set on my review. Now this can be done at the server level or at the review level. So this particular review is in inspection. If I want to edit this, I can come in and restrict access to participants only. And then anybody that's not assigned to this review can't access it and see it. So this is a setting that can be done on the individual review level, as I've done here, or under admin functionality, you can set this as a server-wide thing for access restrictions based on there we go, restrict access to review. You can set this server-wide. So depending on how your server is set up, that it's going to depend on when your reviews are created. So from Boris, can I please talk about the Simulink integration in the last few minutes? Certainly. So I'm going to start, Boris, with a brief apology. My Simulink license has expired. We're in process with Mathworks to get set up on their partner program. That's tied up in legal, so I don't currently have access to that particular plugin integration. What I will do, we do have, let me go to my online video portal, which is Wistia. And I'm going to drop a link in here showing you for a video that has more information on that Simulink process. So I'm going to search on Simulink. We've got our Simulink model support. This is a very short video. So here is I think this is a webinar that I did on the Simulink. So what I'll do is I'll copy this link and I will drop this in the chat window for everybody that has interest in it to everyone. There you go. Now, the Simulink integration is, like I said, done with the plugin or through the manual uploads. With the manual upload process, we can take this same review that we're working on here. We can always manually upload files. So on Simulink, you do need to be at version 13.6 or higher on the Collaborator server. You also need to have Simulink 2018 or newer for the manual upload process. You're going to see you have an option to bring in archives. So we export out of Simulink into that web HTML format, and we can upload those files. And I've stored them here on my local drive. So this is just a simple example. We can bring this file in. Now, the plugin tool handles all of this for you, and you can attach to existing reviews. And we're now going to see that Simulink file attached to my review. And in my diff viewer, it's going to render this, taking all the SVG information from the graphics and even bringing those in and letting you diff on graphics. Just to show you what the diff looks like, I'll upload that other version. Give you a brief look at the diff. So now I have uploaded at least one version of this file, and now we're going to see those side-by-side comparisons. And Collaborator, as with code files, is going to highlight diffs in yellow. So we can see here that my mode parameter or my model parameter has been updated, as well as my date and time. And just with other artifacts in Collaborator, we can select items, leave comments, mark defects against individual parameters. We can mark them against individual components. We can zoom in. We can double click on our components and take a look at those components. We can, again, mark comments. And we're going to see highlights in these as we add comments. It'll highlight our commented and defected components with the appropriate outlining, so you know that those comments are there. So you get the full functionality of the review tool in the Simulink models as well. Again, follow that link to go through a more advanced viewing on how the plugin tool works. My apologies, I had hoped to have that resolved, but as many of you that work with legal organizations, and no offense if you're on the phone and are in legal, you know that can take some time. So we're close to the top of our hour here today. There's so much stuff that I wanted to talk to you today. I do want to show you a brief look at the Jira integration. We can mark up defects and move defects to Jira. I'm just going to add a comment here on my review as a whole as a defect. We're going to classify it and just add a defect. So with defects, we have a couple of options on external tools. So I can track it externally, or I can export the issue. If I track it externally and I know my Jira project, I can simply type in the regex expression for that project, and it's going to create those bidirectional communications. If I don't have a project, I can export the issue to a new project. This is associated maybe with project 8. I can create a new issue out in Jira based on the project mappings into Jira. You can see I've got many projects mapped. I'm going to stay with Collab today. I can classify the type of issue and create this issue. Now this is going to reach out to that webhooks integration, communicate to Jira, and we're going to see that it creates a new issue in that particular project and assigns it the next available number. It also hyperlinks it to that Jira integration. We'll see that here in the chat as well as in my remote systems integrations. If we follow this out to Jira, we're going to see the information we submitted in that form, a link back to Collaborator. So if you're in Jira and there's associated Collaborator reviews, you're going to see those. And this is the basic integration. Beyond that, we have our Collaborator plugin for Jira that gives you more information. We can link to existing reviews, create new reviews right out of Jira. This is that manual process. We'll also see more information on given reviews, links to pull requests in GitHub if those apply, links to other Jira issues if this is tied to another issue, and who's participating. So in summary, I know we've covered a lot of information today, but we've also barely scratched the surface. All right, Chris, one last comment. One issue in the past is that Jira integration could only create issues if the issue type only had the basic summary description fields as required. Does Collab now have better support for customized Jira configurations where you may have custom fields that may be required to open a new issue? So we're still not quite at that point. Chris, if you do need that, please log in to our support page. I'll bring that up, support.smartbear.com, and add that feature request. So follow on to Collaborator, and you're going to see a new layout here on our support page where you have an option here to add that feature request. So please, the old saying, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. The more we hear from users about particular types of features, the more likely we are to take those into consideration for development. So again, I know we're right at the top of our hour, so let's go ahead and wrap things up. We've barely scratched the surface on everything our integrations can do. I do want to thank everyone for their time and attention and make you aware that session number 3 is coming up on September 9th. We're going to be talking about ramping up with new review types. So things you may not have considered with document reviews, Simulink reviews, and Boris, yes, I hope to have a Simulink license by that time so that we can show you that additional functionality. So please join us on September 9th for our next session. Thanks, Michael. I appreciate the feedback. Thanks for coming in. Thanks for joining us today. Have a great day, everyone.